If you cast your mind back to the first talk on this series, which we've called Building on Emptiness, I spoke about how despite this underlying idea in Buddhism that all things are empty, all things are shunya, which means lacking in any sort of fixed, independent self-nature. Despite this fact that everything's empty, Buddhists build. You might think that you couldn't build anything in such a world, but Buddhists do in fact build on emptiness, and always have. In fact, this emptiness of things, which is a way of saying that nothing else is fixed and permanent, nothing is fixed and permanent, it's nature, means that new and wonderful things can arise. Things that have never existed before can arise. The world is a place of infinite potential. We don't have to be limited by the past, by what has been. We can create a world between us that is beyond anything that we can conceive now, if our conceiving is just based on our past experience and what we think has been possible in the past. We can build something far more wonderful. And I also said that, well, in a way, what Buddhists build, it's got two main aspects. Firstly, we build a better self. We build on our potential to be wise, strong, loving beings. We let that manifest, that potential to be that manifest. Or we could say that we allow something bigger than that small self to shine through us. That's three ways of saying the same thing, really. Easier to just talk about building a better self, although it's a bit one-sided. So we build a better self. And secondly, we come together with others to create an environment in which we can begin to manifest our full potential. We don't exist in splendid isolation. We can only exist in relationship to others and in relationship to the world around us. That is the nature of our existence. So if we want to become the people we've got the potential to be, we also need to create the environment in which that can happen. To use traditional sort of mythic or mythopoetic language, we build that environment, we call it building a Buddha land. It's traditionally called building a Buddha land, building a Buddha field, creating a pure land. And traditionally, this sort of a Buddha field is like a force field or a magnetic field. It's the field that an advanced spiritual being creates around themselves, in which people who've got a real strong connection with that being can exist and flourish and blossom. And often such a Buddha field is described as like a wonderful world in another dimension where the trees all make music and the air feels like satin and the very touch of the water is like bliss and the birds all sing the Dharma and etc., etc., etc. And everything's made of jewels and lights, and it's absolutely wonderful. But in going back to that very first talk in the series, we heard how an important Buddhist text called the Teaching of Vimalakirti, how this text tells us that a Buddha land or a pure land is actually created right here. It's created right here by the practice of human beings. And according to this text, according to the Teaching of Vimalakirti, part of the practice of a bodhisattva, if you like, the ideal Buddhist practitioner, part of their practice is precisely to create a Buddha field, to create an environment around themselves, a pure land. And they do this by gathering and inspiring a community. A community of living beings, and the Buddha land, if you like, the pure land, is created out of their generosity, their ethical behavior, their higher mental states, their wisdom, their metta. That's what a practitioner does. They gather a community. That could be a bit of a tall order for one person. So the founder of our order, Sangha, he has advised us, well, actually thinking of yourself as a bodhisattva could get a little bit hubristic. You could get a little proud of being a bodhisattva. So don't think of yourself as being a bodhisattva. But think of coming together with others to do that. Think of coming together with others to partake in bodhisattva activity. Think of coming together with others, as it were, to create a bodhisattva that's bigger than any of us. Do what a bodhisattva does. Gather a community, create a pure land. So he encourages us to see our centres that way, as a focus around which we gather a spiritual community to create a Buddha field. He talks about creating what he calls mini pure lands, in which beings can thrive and develop in the midst of a society that in many ways is hostile to spiritual growth. So our practice has got those two dimensions. It's got, if you like, the inner dimension about ourselves, but it's also got this outer dimension about coming together with others to mutually create an environment in which we can begin to manifest what's best in us. And those two aspects really do have to be there for our practice to take off. We can make some positive changes by just focusing on ourselves, but after a while, the progress we make will be limited unless we take part in this activity of creating Sangha. And so far, I said there are two aspects, ourselves and, as it were, creating the Sangha around us. It's so far in this series been looking mainly at the first of those aspects, how we work on ourselves. We've often talked in this rather sort of clumpy sort of idiom about building the Buddha land and making ourselves worthy bricks, which is a bit sort of heavy. But yeah, we need to make ourselves into the sort of material from which we can create the Buddha land. And that's mainly what we've been talking about so far. And we've been looking at it in terms of what Sangha calls the 5 aspects, the 5 stages, 5 aspects of the spiritual path, the spiritual life. Integration, which we've called becoming an individual. Positive emotion, which we've called becoming a connected individual. Spiritual death and spiritual rebirth, which tend to go together. Well, they need to go together, because if you just die and don't get reborn, you're dead. You're nowhere. Spiritual death and spiritual rebirth, which Aryadasa talked about a couple of weeks ago. And finally, receptivity, which takes place in all of these, which Dharma Maya is going to talk about in 2 weeks' time. So yeah, last week Aryadasa talked about becoming more than an individual. How we become, yes, we become an individual. We need to be individuals. But at the same time, we become someone who exists in relationship to something higher than ourselves. Something beyond our small selves. We allow something beyond our small selves to shine through us and act through us. So we have that dual nature, individuals, but also manifesting something which is transpersonal, which is beyond the individual. And we heard how that something that we manifest, well, it could be called the Dharma Niyama, a sort of jargon term for the dharmic strand in the web of conditionality that we're all part of. Or more traditionally, it could be called the bodhicitta, which simply translates as enlightened mind or enlightened heart. This is an enlightened mind which doesn't exist, it's not the property of any one individual. It exists beyond the mind of any individual. But it can manifest through different individuals. And the analogy that's often used in the tradition is the reflection of the moon. The reflection of the moon can exist in puddles, many different puddles, ponds, lakes. But the moon is not in any of them. The moon is something beyond all of them that can be reflected in those individual bodies of water. So yeah, Ariadasa introduced, talking about being an individual but responding to something higher, responding to something greater. Ariadasa introduced a traditional image for a community of people motivated by the bodhicitta, which is, oh, it's gone. Oh, well, never mind. Used to be there. Was there for a long time. It was the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. Ariadasa introduced this idea of this image, symbol of the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara, this being who has 1,000 arms offering different things to the world, many, many different things, representing many, many different individuals who all come together to create something greater than themselves. And he has two of his hands hold at his heart this jewel, which is what unites all these individuals with all their different uniquenesses and all their different talents. What unites them is what he holds to his heart, which is the bodhicitta. They're all responding to the bodhicitta. They're all puddles? No, maybe not. They're all responding to the bodhicitta in one way or another, but in many, many different ways. Yes, our founder, Sangha, actually suggests that should be a symbol of our order, that we should aspire to be like the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara. Each of us individuals, each offering something unique to the world, each of us responding to something which is actually beyond any of us. And we also use it as a symbol for what we're trying to create at this Buddhist centre. So the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara could say it's a symbol of an ideal Sangha. But I think it could also be a symbol for something, well, it could be a symbol for our goal, for what we're aiming to bring into existence by our practice, by following the spiritual path. Our goal, our idea of enlightenment itself, has got to include others. It's got to include others. Because we never exist in isolation. We only exist in relationship to others in the world. We can only be fulfilled and we can only manifest our full potential in community or even communion with others. We can never exist in isolation and complete independence. That's not the way anything exists. And for that reason, I think this symbol of the solitary seated Buddha, inspiring as it is, and with all the sort of weight that it has, it can give us a misleading idea of what we're aiming for by practicing the Dharma. We could get the idea that the goal is to be solitary, completely independent, completely detached above it all. And maybe there's nothing wrong with being those things, but not just those things. Of course, an enlightened being is above it all. But at the same time, they're also intimately related to other beings in the material world. They exist in complete solidarity with other beings. So in some ways, the 1,000-armed Avalokiteshvara is a better symbol of the goal because it's an image that includes others. And it puts all those others in a relationship with each other and with something higher than themselves. The jewel of the bodhicitta that it holds at its heart. Okay, we all know that the so-called three jewels of Buddhism are Buddha, Dharma, and Sangha. And we often say the Buddha represents our potential. The Dharma represents the way we practice to achieve that potential. And the Sangha represents the spiritual community that sort of helps us along our way to doing that. So we tend to think of our goal as becoming a Buddha. And the ultimate goal is becoming a Buddha. And we tend to think of the Sangha as just something that we need to help us to get there. We tend to think, I need a Sangha to help my development. I come first. and what's outside me comes second. What's beyond me comes second. It's insofar, it's useful, necessary, and only insofar as it serves me. Me becoming a Buddha is the real business. But being all about me is our whole problem. Our central delusion is that we think we exist independently, and what's more, we think we're the most important thing in the universe. I remember somebody once saying, if you listen deeply to the noise, there's the sound the universe is making, there's a deep throbbing coming from the universe, and it's going, me, me, me. So our practice has got to take us beyond that delusion. And the way to do that is to make creating Sangha a central part of our practice, a central part of what we do. So in fact, creating Sangha is an end in itself. It's part of the goal. It's just as much part of the goal as creating the Buddha. We can't separate the two. We cannot separate the two. We cannot separate ourselves from the environment in which we exist, and a lot of that environment is people. The two intimately interact to create a whole situation. And that whole situation is the only thing that actually exists. You can't take one bit out of it and have it exist separately from the whole situation. Any more than you can take, if you met some imaginary being in your dream last night, any more than you can take them and have them separate from the dream. There they are, they're separate from the dream. Or I was trying to think of what's a currently fashionable cartoon character? I don't know. I was thinking Jessica Rabbit, but that's probably, no, I shouldn't do that. You can't take them out of that cartoon world and have them separate. They exist as part of their world, and we do. I was thinking, taking the character from Poldark, who seems to be quite popular recently for some reason, and putting him in EastEnders. He'd be going, "Oh, let's mine some copper," and they'd be going, "Excuse me?" We and our environment, we're a whole. There's a whole situation. You can't sort of take a bit out of it. That's one of the things that Pratitya Samutpada, I think, is about. So the thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara, in some ways, is a better symbol for our overall goal than the solitary Buddha. And we could say maybe the same of the Pure Land. And the Pure Land is also a symbol of enlightenment. The Buddha Land. It's a field of influence of a highly developed being, in which they're in communion with others. And it's beautiful and it's lovely and etc., etc. In some ways, it's a much more full symbol of what enlightenment would be like than just sitting there with one's eyes closed in splendid isolation. And I think what those two images of the thousand-armed Avalokiteshvara and the Buddha Land, what they make clear is that bringing Sangha into existence is part of the goal. It's part of the goal, so that taking part in the creation of Sangha is not an optional extra in the spiritual life. It's not as though, what's really important is that meditation that I do at home. Taking part in the Sangha is absolutely crucial. To get far, it has to be part of our practice. That doesn't necessarily mean that running Buddhist centres or working in Buddhist institutions has to be part of our practice, although it could do. And although those things are absolutely necessary for the creation of Sangha. You can't create Sangha without somewhere to do it and without institutions. And it involves all sorts of activities like the things we do at this Buddhist centre, but it doesn't necessarily have to involve that. And it certainly doesn't mean anything abstract. Sangha, it's really difficult to talk about. It's something that's created when people come together and are a particular way with each other. When there's a certain sort of interaction and empathy and communication and unity among them, so that something arises which is more than the sum of the parts. In the way that an organism like a human being is more than the sum of its parts, some of our parts. So, I mean, I say a human being is more than the sum of our parts. You can't predict what a human being would think or feel or do or create by sort of looking at their spleen and their liver and their kidneys, or even their heart, or even their brain. You couldn't find, say, Beethoven's Ninth Symphony by looking at his organs, you know. And where is it? It's in here somewhere. Or looking at his cells under the microscope. Beethoven was much more than the sum of his parts. His being inhabited realms and dimensions beyond the realm in which his organs existed. And that's what he put down on a score to make his Ninth Symphony. And in the same way, Sangha is something that's created by individuals coming together in the way that Beethoven's organs existed together, but it's much more than the sum of those individuals. We could say it exists in a dimension beyond the realm in which those individuals exist. When real Sangha exists, something entirely new has come into being. Something that could never have been predicted from the parts, or from what had existed in the past. Something quite magical. Which you can feel, but you can't define. Maybe you've sometimes felt at least a hint or a glimmer of it around this Buddhist Centre, maybe. Maybe it's a little bit of that light of the bodhicitta shining through some sort of window that it creates. So yeah, Sangha is quite mysterious. It's not, it doesn't mean, hey, 70 people turned up to our Sangha night, so we've got a Sangha. Well, we might not have, actually. But not surprisingly, the Buddha gave a lot of teachings about creating Sangha. So we've got some instructions. How do we create Sangha? Yippee, he told us. He gave us loads of lists. He gave us the 4 Samgrahavastu's, the 4 means of unification, which we talked about in the first week, as the way that a bodhisattva gathers a community. I'm not going to repeat those. You can go back and listen to my first talk, which is on the web. Then there's another sutta in which the Buddha gave 7 conditions for the thriving of a Sangha. I'm not going to go into them all, don't worry. But the first one is turn up. The first one is actually a Sangha will thrive if people meet together often and in large numbers. We need to turn up for a Sangha to exist. Doing that is part of our practice, because creating Sangha is part of our practice. I've noticed, and probably experienced this myself, that when we've been practicing for a while, we can think, well, I won't learn anything new at Sangha night, or I wouldn't learn anything new by helping with that beginner's course. So I won't go. When we start thinking like that, well, what am I going to get out of it? I'm afraid it could be a bit of a sign that we've lost the plot. Just turning up is part of the way we create Sangha, and creating Sangha needs to be our practice. Sangha only exists when we come together. If we're not there, we're not part of the Sangha. It's as simple as that. So we need to turn up. And that's part of our practice. It's part of our practice to be there, however experienced we are, to be there to help create the Sangha. So there's another quite interesting sutta in which the Buddha is talking, where he talks about what makes a Sangha. He's talking to a community where there had been a falling out. So the community had divided into 2 factions, the followers of the meditation teacher and the followers of the Dharma teacher, who, about something quite trivial. And the text says something like they were stabbing each other with verbal daggers, and they could neither convince each other nor be convinced by each other. And somebody tells the Buddha about this, and he goes to see them, and he gives them a right telling off. And he says, "Foolish men." Actually, one of the translations says, "You stupid men. This will, you stupid men, you foolish men, this will cause you suffering for a long time." And I think there's quite a serious warning in that creating divisions in the Sangha by gossiping about what that lot are doing or what this lot are like is actually seriously bad karma. Seriously bad karma. Creating divisions in the Sangha will cause you suffering for a long time. So let's not do it. Scary. So he then goes on to say, well, this is what you should do. He talks about you create harmony by acts of loving kindness with body, speech and mind in public and in private. So there's a lot there. Acts of loving kindness and body, you do things for people. Acts of loving kindness of speech, you speak well of people, you praise them, you don't criticize them unless it's really in their best interests. And mind. Mind, that's quite interesting. Do the metta bhavana. Acts of loving kindness of mind in private. That's got to mean meditation, actually. That's got to mean thinking kindly about people when they're not there, when you're not with them. So basically, practicing the metta bhavana, putting it into practice in all aspects of our practice. And he goes on and he says, well, also what's essential to harmony is a shared ethic, shared ethical principles. And I think that's really important because a Sangha can only exist if we trust each other, actually. And we can only trust each other if we know we share an ethic. We know that, you know, you can, around this Buddhist Centre, for example, you know that nobody's going to nick your cup of tea or something. You know, I mean, you know, there's a shared ethic. There's a shared ethic. That's a bit of a joke, but there's a shared ethic, which means we can trust each other. But I think it's important that it's a shared ethic. It's a shared ethic. In a way, there's a warning against finding ways to feel that we've got a better set of ethics than others that's not shared. Some special rules we'd like to sort of make ourselves a bit special with and lecture others about. It's a shared ethic. But even that's not enough. He talks about a Sangha needs a shared vision. A shared vision. So a Sangha is not just any old community. It's not even just any old positive ethical community. It's not even any old positive ethical community where people are really nice to each other. It's actually more than that. It needs a shared vision. It absolutely needs a shared vision. I suppose I know this a bit because, confession, I was a bit of a hippie in the early 70s, and I lived in some communities. No, they weren't communities, we used to call them communes. Frankly, they were a bit of a nightmare. Because we had these wonderful ideas, but everybody had different ones. And they all, without exception, fell apart disastrously because of lack of a shared ethic, actually, and lack of a shared vision. Shared ethics, shared vision, essential to having a community that really works. So, we need a shared vision. We need a Buddhist vision. And to have that shared vision, we each need to listen to the Dharma and study the Dharma over and over again so that the Dharmic vision soaks into our bones. We need to listen to it, we need to reflect on it, we need to meditate on it so that it soaks into our bones, so that Dharmic vision becomes part of the way we see the world and part of the way we think. And then we need to apply that. That needs to be our vision of the world, and not to import all sorts of worldly ideologies and priorities and ways of thinking, all those ideologies that happen to be fashionable right now, that can actually be quite divisive. They tend to, I'm into Buddhism and this, Buddhism and that. But the this or the that usually become a bit more important than the Buddhism, and sort of sets up a sort of factionalism. And there are ways of thinking which are fashionable right now, which, well, if we think back to previous ages, we'd probably find that people weren't really stupid. But the way people, even the way people dress, I talked about the 70s. I mean, you look at the way people dressed, and it's positively embarrassing. How could we have done that? And believe it or not, this age is going to look like that. And the things that are like really important now, people are going to go, what were they on about? What were they about? So let's not get too tied up in those things, okay? Would the Buddha have thought that? Has it lasted for thousands of years as a way of thinking? Might be a more skillful way of looking at things. So yeah, we need a dharmic vision. We need a shared dharmic vision. So what happens? The Buddha tells people, tells the people of Kosambi, which is where this is what you need to do. You need to have acts of loving kindness of body, speech, and mind in public and in private towards each other. You need a shared vision, you need a shared ethic. And they say, well, yeah, and we'll sort this out. They really attached to their divisions. They're really attached to their divisions. They tell the Buddha to go away, basically, that they'll sort it out. They are really attached to their factionalism. And they won't be reconciled. And what in fact happens is that the lay people force them to be reconciled, because the lay people get so cheesed off with them, they stop feeding them. Which if you're a monk who depends on, or a renunciant who depends on getting some food in your begging bowl, suddenly becomes a really convincing argument for why you should settle your quarrel. So yeah, I think we can learn a few things from that. The Sangha in the Buddha's time weren't all saints. That's one thing. If you read the Vinaya and some of the rules, you realise they really weren't all saints some of the time. They needed a rule about that. I won't go into details. So they weren't all saints, but there's teaching. There's a teaching about that community about what we shouldn't do, which is what we shouldn't do is fail to forgive and fail to apologise. We human beings, we're all, the Buddha tells us we're all actually a bit mad. We're not seeing the world the way it is. And it's a bit like we're trying to overcome that. But so we're trying to build a Sangha in which we all behave in this sane way. But sometimes we will fall back. Sometimes we will fall back. We all do. We all sometimes act unskillfully. We're all like people who've been poisoned or knocked on the head, so we're not in our right senses. And if our friend has been knocked in the head or poisoned and they're not in their right senses and they do something, somebody we love does something really, really unskillful, well, we take into account their state. We don't hold that against them. We think, our response is compassion. Our response is compassion. And that should be our response to people in a Sangha who sometimes act unethically. And we should bear in mind that we too act unethically. We too act unethically. We will be unskillful. We will not be perfect, and other people will not be perfect. So we need to heal breaches when they arrive. We need to apologize for our own unskillfulness. Very readily apologize, not dig in behind our particular position. We need to apologize. And we need to forgive. We need to forgive other people. We're all trying to act from what is highest. create a community in which we all do that, but we will often fail. We will sometimes fall off that tightrope and act unskillfully. And then we need to get back on that tightrope, basically. And if we can't forgive others when they do that, when they fall off the tightrope, if we expect people to be perfect, we cannot create a Sangha. We'll create a divided community, like the one I've been talking about. So they basically told the Buddha to go away and leave them to their devices. So the Buddha did, and he went to seek a small community that was, just the absolute opposite of what he'd just seen. Presumably he did this for a bit of light relief. And he went to see three friends, who get termed the Aniruddhas, although only one of them was called Aniruddha, but they get termed the Aniruddhas. And these friends describe themselves. So the Buddha arrives, and the first question he asks is, are you living in harmony? I mean, he's seen a group that's not living in harmony. Are you living in harmony? Do you blend together like milk and water? And they say, yeah, we're living in harmony. In fact, they say, we are several in body, but one in mind. Several in body, but one in mind. And as the sutta goes on, you realise that they're in a state that's beyond probably what we can imagine, because they're actually quite telepathic with each other. They really are several in body, but one in mind. They're individuals, but they're also partaking of a different level of consciousness, which is beyond the individual. There's several in body and one in mind, and this is the basis. It's obvious from the sutta, this is the basis for a very high level of realization among them. And they tell the Buddha how they practice to bring this about. So this is where I suppose the lesson for us comes. And the first thing is quite down to earth. They cooperate on practical tasks. They cooperate on practical tasks. Things need to be done, and they get on and do them. And sometimes they do them on their own, and sometimes they do them with others in a spirit of very high degree of cooperation. Things need to be done, so that's great. And doing things together, cooperating on practical tasks, is part of the way we human beings create bonds with each other. We don't only create bonds with each other by having deep, meaningful conversations about our relationships at Dana Cafe over a cup of coffee. I'm not even sure that does create bonds between people. It's just sort of like, you be my therapist and I'll tell you everything. Human beings create bonds by working together. They always have. So that's one of the things we can do. And that might be an intro to something about the summer fair, actually. We have lots of opportunities for working together. See Surya Mati about cooperating to create the summer fair. So that's one of the things they do. They cooperate. They cooperate on practical tasks. And the second thing they say, that one of them says is, well, as for that, I think it is a gain for me. It is a great gain for me that I am living with such companions in the holy life. So each of them reflects on the benefit that he receives from his friendship, his companionship with the others, with his Sangha. In other words, they do a gratitude exercise with respect to each other, much like the gratitude exercise that we do on our introductory courses, our intermediate course. They call to mind the ways that they benefit, and they rejoice in that. It's a gain for me. It's a great gain for me that I'm living with such companions in the holy life. Gratitude is hugely important emotion, I think, in the Dharma. And we probably need to, it's about becoming aware. So the word for gratitude in Sanskrit and Pali is actually means knowledge of benefits received. So we don't have to We don't have to sort of squeeze out I'm so grateful. We just have to think of the ways we benefit, and that's what they do. They think of the ways they benefit from the others, from their companionship with the others. And of course, that creates metta. Of course, that erodes the differences between them. As I said in that first talk a few weeks ago, gratitude is the emotional counterpart of the wisdom of seeing interconnectedness. When we see that, when we see how dependent we are on others, how dependent we are on our environment, gratitude is the emotional response to that. That's really worth making a conscious part of our practice, because unless we make ourselves conscious of the benefits we receive, they just sort of slide by. We're just unaware. And another thing that they say they do is they say, I reflect. Why should I not set aside what I wish to do and do what these other venerable ones wish to do? So I think that's got two aspects, really. Why should I not set aside what I wish to do and do what these venerable ones wish to do? Firstly is sitting light to our own wants and likes and dislikes. We can get very hard and fast, I've got to get what I like. And what I like is often in conflict with what other people like. But I've got to have what I like, and I've got to not have what I dislike. But actually, our likes and dislikes are pretty arbitrary, actually. We did this exercise on the ordination retreat, the long 4-month ordination retreat that I was on. Everybody, there's very little sort of obvious sensual pleasures on an ordination retreat, and people got it from breakfast. So it starts out as sort of a bit of muesli, and it ends up with muesli, it's got to have this, and it's got to have that, it's got to have this, and it's got to have that. And the most amazing concoctions. How can anybody eat that? That's amazing. But people would develop this really complex breakfast. It had to have a particular sort of tea and a particular sort of this and that. So we did this thing where we all we wrote our breakfast down and we all put it in a hat, and then we chose somebody else's. And mostly that was okay, except mine was oats, water, and chamomile tea. And, well, we mustn't have ill will to our brothers in the Dharma, but I never saw anybody eating oats, water, and chamomile tea. But we get to build up these likes and dislikes, and they're arbitrary. There's a phrase that Hamlet says, Shakespeare's Hamlet, he says, there is nothing good or bad, but thinking makes it so. And he doesn't mean ethically good or bad. It just means, that's so wonderful and that's so terrible. It's all values we ascribe to things. So yeah, going beyond our likes and dislikes. An order member gave a talk about this once who was it? It was, anyway, I can't remember his name. I know him, but I can't remember his name. It's sort of old age. Anyway, he said, all our likes and dislikes are completely arbitrary, except barley cup, which is objectively horrible. But yeah, so we go beyond our likes and dislikes. We allow ourselves to go beyond our likes and dislikes, and we imaginatively connect with others so that we get a sense of what they need. We empathize. We get a sense of how others see the world. We put ourselves in others' shoes. We consciously put ourselves in others' shoes. There's a practice which becomes very important in later Buddhism called exchanging self for other. Exchanging self for other. Put yourself in somebody else's shoes and then make it a practice in daily life to actually do what they want to do rather than what you want to do. This is a really powerful way of getting beyond this central problem that I always put myself first. I always put myself first. So let's, as it were, bend the straw the other way by, why don't I just always put this person first? So yeah, counteracting by choosing to put another's desires first. It's probably a quite advanced practice, actually, and maybe not for us if we tend to be a bit submissive and not very assertive in the way we go about things, but you could try it. But even if that's a bit advanced, we can begin to put ourselves in others' shoes by doing the metta bhavana. The metta bhavana is a practice in which we really try to put ourselves in another's shoes. What do I look like through their eyes, rather than what do they look like through mine? That person who really annoys me, what do they feel when they see me come into the room? Putting ourselves in others' shoes, it requires imagination, but it's a real expansion of our wisdom. I mean, part of our lack of wisdom is that we just see things from this one perspective, one pair of eyes. So anyway, that's the Aniruddhas, several in body and one in mind. Clearly very aware of what's going on in each other's minds, highly advanced practitioners. They're an inspiring example of Sangha, an inspiring example of Sangha as a goal, an inspiring example of a completely different way of human beings existing together, in which they come together to create something greater than any of them could on their own, in which they come together and that coming together causes them to rise to a higher level of consciousness that they mutually create. So real spiritual development is not going to be about each of us vanishing into our own private, detached world, cut off from other people, which surely would be very boring, apart from anything else. Real spiritual development surely is going to involve us entering into deeper and deeper community, deeper and deeper levels of community, even deeper and deeper levels of what you might call communion, joining with others, as with the Aniruddhas, becoming more and more connected, less and less separated. I don't know about you, but I find my separateness from other people that I love and feel warmth for, I find it painful. I mean, I know I'm egocentric, etc., but I still find it painful. I find it painful that I am so separated from people. And somewhere at the back of my being, there's a longing, almost to be part of them, to be joined with them, for them to be part of me. Each of us unique, but with these sort of absolute hard barriers of ego softened and dissolved. And I think this longing is part of a longing for another world, actually. A world that we really feel we belong to. It's the Buddha land, it's the pure land, it's the place we could be if we really manifested our potential. And we create a little bit of this world we long for when we come together to create that mysterious thing called Sangha. So let's do it in our practice.